Hello, welcome to another Genealogy Center program. We are so happy you are able to join us on this Thursday evening or whatever time it is, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for a presentation. We hope that you enjoy this presentation and all the presentations that we are doing twice a week. So make sure to register for every program that is interesting to you. So I am going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the day. It is Sara Allen. She is our in-house DNA expert, and she is giving a different type of program today. So I'm so excited that you guys get to hear something outside of DNA from Sara, because she has such an amazing set of skills with genealogy research. And I'm excited to hear this program, and I hope you guys are too. So Sara, do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Welcome, everyone. Again, as Allison said, glad to be here tonight. And the title of this talk is Finding Your Ancestral Homeland. And it's going to be a little different talk than some others. It's not going to be really a methodology talk, but we're going to talk about my personal story of finding my immigrant ancestral homeland in Eastern Europe, and how we took a trip there in 2007 to visit some family villages and meet some long lost family. In the process of telling you the story, though, I think you will be able to get some tips and tricks from what I did that was useful and what I did that didn't actually work very well. So hopefully you will learn quite a bit from my story. Now, when you are seeking out an immigrant ancestor, typically what you do need to find is the name of the village that person came here from, wherever the old country was, in Europe or in another place in the world. If you know the name of the village, then you can usually go back and do some research back in the old country. Now, how do you find the name of the village? Well, usually you're going to have to get it from a U.S. record that tells you the name of the village, or a family source if your family happens to know the village. So that's really what your goal should be if you're researching your immigrant ancestors, is to identify that village. So that's going to be the goal of what I was doing with my family story. So we've got a blast from the past here. Here I am at about age 13. I got started doing genealogy when I was about 11, and my mother and I were working on it together. And she pretty soon had her side of the family in hand. And so I started thinking, well, someone needs to look at my dad's side of the family. And I'm glad that I did that, because some of my relatives on my dad's side of the family were quite elderly at that point in time, and they died about 4 or 5 years later after I started working on the family history. So had I not spoken with them when I did, I wouldn't have gotten all the information out of them that they knew. So here is my father's side of the tree. You can see that my paternal grandfather, David Allen, has Anglo-Saxon type names, and actually his side of the family, the Allens and the Browns, have been in this country for generations. But you can see that my paternal grandmother, Fanny, has a non-Anglo-Saxon name, and it's an Eastern European name. And so my great-grandparents, Joseph Caesar and Mary Pischouts, are from Eastern Europe. We were always told Austria. And my grandmother was born in 1907 here in the US. So we suspected, we didn't know at first when we started this research exactly when they came over, but we thought it was around 1905, 1906, somewhere around in that vicinity. Now, when I say we, I was aided by my great Aunt Lil, and I just called her Aunt Lil, and she's my grandma's sister. Grandma was not interested in genealogy. Grandma was a wonderful grandma, but She was interested in the here and now, and she considered the old country just ancient past. And why would we want to talk about that when, we're living here in the USA now? So Aunt Lil wanted to know about the family genealogy. And she was an elderly woman at this time, and I was about 13 or 14. So you could see we're kind of hobbled in what we could figure out. But I think the two of us working together actually accomplished a great deal. And the first thing you want to do, I wanted to make this point. Aunt Lil and I were working on this in the 1980s. So things were different in the 1980s. We got different fashions, we had different TV shows, and you had different ways of doing genealogical research. I will, at some points during this presentation, tell you what Aunt Lil and I did, and then I'll tell you, this is what you should do today. But basically in the 1980s, your genealogical research was done in 3 different ways. You could make phone calls to places to get information over the phone. You could write letters in the US mail, put a stamp on it, put it in the mailbox, send it out, wait for a reply, or you could get in your car and you could drive places. Those were about the extent of what you could do. And so you had to go to libraries, you had to go to archives, you had to go to courthouses. You couldn't do anything online. There was no such thing as online, at least in the genealogy world. So we started with what I would suggest everybody start with, which is home sources. And those are records that you already have in your home. And so Aunt Lil had a lot of records in her home because she lived in the family home. She never married, and she lived in the home with her mother, Mary Caesar, until Mary died. And then Lil lived in the home. And so all of the family documents and photographs were there in the home with Aunt Lil. Now, I got the impression that they weren't particularly organized well, because she would, every couple months, she would send me more stuff that she found. And she was sending me photocopies mostly of her documents. She kept the documents for herself, but she was sending me photocopies. And so over the course of several years, she would send me photocopies every, couple months of things that she had found. She also talked to her brother, her older brother, Joe, and she got some information out of him. And I looked at my grandma's paperwork to see whether she had anything that was useful. So home sources, this is like photographs and documents and obituaries and prayer cards and different things like that. So this is one of the pictures that Aunt Lil had. And this is showing you my grandma and 4 of her siblings. Now, grandma's the one with the big bow in her hair. I don't know what was going on with that. And Aunt Lil is over on the left. And Mary is in the middle. Now, Mary is the oldest sister, and she was the self-described kind of boss of the family. She bossed all the brothers and sisters, and probably her parents too. She was a very capable woman, but there were hard feelings. At one point or another, all of these siblings were not speaking to one another for some reason or another. I never understood what all their issues were. They were all very kind and nice to me and my brother and sister, but kind of mean to each other, unfortunately. And Aunt Mary, as I mentioned, Aunt Lil was helping me with the genealogy. And then Aunt Lil died when I was in college, and Aunt Mary went and cleaned out her house and threw out all the family documents and pictures. So there are no family documents and pictures from this side of the family that were saved by Mary. She threw them all out, probably because she was jealous of Aunt Lil and my friendship and our working on this project together. So that was unfortunate and very heartbreaking, but I kind of expected something like that to happen, so I wasn't completely taken off guard. So the family moved to Bedford, Indiana by the time that this picture was taken. Aunt Lil also produced the obituaries of her parents and some pictures of her parents. So these are the immigrant ancestors, my immigrant ancestors. This is my great-grandma, Mary. Her maiden name was Peschaut, and it was spelled in a lot of different ways. in different records, and her last name was Caesar. And in her obituary, we can see that it has a birth date, a birthplace, and who her parents were. However, you always got to remember who supplied the information for the obituary. In this case, it would have been Aunt Mary, who was, the boss of the family. Did Aunt Mary know all of the pertinent details? I do happen to know that some of the information, some of the little details in this obituary are incorrect, but we're just going to record those and, keep looking for other pieces of information. And that's what you've got to do, especially with your Eastern European immigrants. The names, the dates, the places, everything is spelled multiple ways. You get different versions of different pieces of information. And so you almost need to create a spreadsheet to keep track of it all. And if that would help you, then I suggest that you do that. We also have her death certificate, which is also a great source of information. You can see that it has her birth date on it again, and it has, she's from Austria, and it has her parents' names again. And it tells us that the informant is Mrs. George Annette, which is the daughter Mary, as I suspected. And then here's my great-grandfather. His name was Joseph Caesar. And his obituary also gives us a lot of good information. His birth date, his parents' names, and that he was a native of Austria. He died 30 years before his wife, and his obituary was probably written in part by her. And she was also from Austria, and they had met and married in Austria. So theoretically, she should know his correct birth date and his correct parents' names. And in fact, these are correct based on what we found when we researched in Austria. And then his death certificate, again, gives us more information, and it repeats the information really from the obituary at this point. Now, Aunt Mary did have some other Aunt Lil did have some other home sources that she shared with me, but we're going to move on, and I'll share some of those with you later on. But we're going to move on to other types of records that are going to tell you about where the family came from in the old country. And that would be arrival in the US, usually a passenger list, and citizenship papers. And so in the case of my great-grandparents, the way that we did not have their passenger list. So Aunt Lil and I did not have that. And we inquired as to how we would get that. And we were told that those records at that time in the 1980s were at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And what we needed to do was write them a letter in the mail. And so we did that, and they sent us back a form that we had to fill out, which we then sent back to them, and we waited with a fee, and then we waited for a while, and we got a reply back. And they were able to find our passenger list for us. Now today, those same passenger lists have been digitized for the most part and are up online in different websites. FamilySearch.org, which should be free, and then Ancestry, Find My Past, My Heritage, I believe all have those passenger lists. So here is a copy of the passenger list for this family. And I blew up some of the pertinent information there in the middle of the screen. And this was remarkably easy for us to find, basically. Like I said, we just wrote to the National Archives. We told them their names and their ages and what country they came from, and that we thought that they came around 1905, 1906, and they sent it back to us. Now, some of you out there are probably going, I've been searching for the passenger list for my ancestors for years, and I can't find it. Well, in my experience dealing with hearing different people tell me about their search for their ancestors' passenger list, I would say there's probably two different things that could be going on. One would be that the passenger list for your ancestors is in poor condition. There are passenger lists that I've seen that are black. I've seen passenger lists with big tears down a column, a pertinent column. I've seen passenger lists with big splotches of where it looks like water damage has happened. I've also seen passenger lists where the handwriting is atrocious. And so can't make head nor tails of it. So that's the first reason that you might be having trouble finding your ancestors' passenger list. The second reason would be name variations and then outright name changes. So if your ancestors used a different name in the old country and you're searching on the name that they used here in the US, that might be a reason why you're not finding their passenger list. And even here on this passenger list that we're looking for Joseph and Mary, you can see that in the US, he used the name Joseph, spelled Joseph. But on this passenger list, he's listed as Joseph, Joseph. And so if I wasn't familiar with that practice of using a slightly different version of the first name, a variant of the first name, I might have passed over this passenger list and said, oh, that's not my ancestors because his name was Joseph with a PH instead of Joseph with an F. And you can see that Mary, who went by Mary in the US, is Maria on this passenger list, which is also a variant. These are probably the European version of their names, what the spelling of their name that they used back in the old country, which we can see on this passenger list is Austria. So let's look across at the passenger list. It says that they are from Austria. It says that their nationality is Slovenian, which Aunt Lil and I had never heard of before. It said that their last residence is Munchen, which I later found out was Munich, Germany. And we'll circle back to that in a minute. And that they are going to Chicago, Illinois as their final destination in the US. Now, as far as we know, they never lived in Germany and they never lived in Munich. And so for a while, I thought that this was a mistake, but I'll never have any way of knowing, I don't believe, why this says Munich here. But we do need to think about the fact that this is 1906. They were in Austria. The ship was sailing from Antwerp, Belgium. In order to get to Antwerp from Austria, they would have taken a train, and that train would have traveled through Germany. Did it go through Munich? Possibly. Munich would be a railroad hub, I'm sure. Perhaps they had to get off the train in Munich. Perhaps they had an emergency and they had to live in Munich for a little while. So that is possible. It's not outside of the realm of possibility. But it was a disappointment because I was hoping to see the town that they had come from in Austria listed on this passenger list. And instead I get Munich. But anyway, let's move on to naturalization papers. So not all of our immigrant ancestors actually did naturalize, but many of them did. And Aunt Lil actually happened to have a copy of her father's naturalization papers, the originals, in her possession, which she shared with me in a photocopy. Then the original got tossed out by Aunt Mary when Aunt Lil died. And so I had to reorder these. And so I ordered them. I knew that he had naturalized probably in Southern Indiana, because that's where they ended up. And so I knew that the State Archives of Indiana has most naturalization records for Indiana. So I requested them from the Indiana State Archives. This is Joseph's Declaration of Intention, which is the first part when he files for naturalization. And then he will have more paperwork in the file as well for when he actually becomes naturalized. But this document has a lot of information. It gives us his birth date, again, of 1878. It gives us his birthplace of Rotmansdorf, Austria. It tells us the ship that he came on, which is the Zealand from Antwerp, Belgium, exactly what we saw. And it has his signature at the bottom. So a lot of good information on this document. Census records, after the family has come to the US, give you a lot of information about their background. And so you should always try to find the family in all the census records. Now, that's going to be difficult for especially Eastern European relatives because their census records are just a mess. I've had, lots of trouble helping people, trouble finding my own family's census records and also helping patrons find their relative census records because they're just a mess. So a lot of problems with maybe spelling of the long European names and a lot of problems with the handwriting of the census taker and people changing their names again and kind of being listed under a slightly different name. So just problems. So in this case, this family should be in the 1910 census. That would be the first census that they would be in since they arrived in 1906. And in the 1910 census, we got really lucky again. If you can see that, the census taker, I had blown it up over there on the right. The census taker had really beautiful handwriting, and that clearly looks like C-E-Z-A-R or O-R, and it clearly looks like Joseph. And so when I typed it in, it came up right away. Here they are, and they're in Chicago, which is where they were headed from the passenger list. And it says that they are Austrian, and their native tongue is Croatian. So we're just going to keep track of what their native tongue is supposed to have been in all these different censuses because we get some different answers. It also tells us the immigration year of 1906, which if we didn't have that information would be useful information for us. Now, 1920 is when we start to have our problems with this family. So as you can see, I've blown it up again, and I think it looks like CEZ, but then the letters after the Z are kind of all scribbled together. And so the person that was reading this and indexing this census did the best that they could. And they thought it said Cruzan, C-R-U-Z-A-N. And of course, he's going by Joe. So not Joseph. So this could also trip you up if your ancestor's using a nickname. So be sure that you're searching for different variants. How did I find this family in the 1920 census? Now they're living in Bedford, Indiana, which is a lot smaller place than Chicago. So I did a search of first name only. I did a search of all the Joes and all the Josephs in Bedford, Indiana, who were born around 1878. And I did a plus or minus a couple years there and in Bedford, Indiana. And then I just started paging through the list until I found somebody that looked like it could be them. And so it says that they're born in Austria. It says their immigration year is 1905 this time. And it says that they're German, Austrian, and then that their native tongue is German. So that's interesting. 1930 census, we have the same problem. The census taker, again, it looks like C-E-Z-A-R to me, but I could see that it also looks like A-Z-E-R or A-Z-A-R, which is what the person that was indexing this census thought it said. So they're listed under Azar. And this time it says that they're from Hungary. So that's the first time we've seen that. So basically, I created this table, but you can do a spreadsheet, you can do different things where I just recorded the differing bits of information that I had found. And I should mention, I haven't shown it up on the screen here, but we had family notes and papers, again, from Aunt Lil and from the house where she lived, that said that Joe Caesar was from Rodmansdorf, Austria. You can see that at the bottom of this table. And that Mary Paschautz, his wife, was from Hudo, H-U-D-O, Austria. So those were the two villages that I was trying to focus in on. So when you get all this conflicting information, you have to try to make some sense of it. And so you want to keep a really open mind and just kind of weigh out the different options. So we know his name was Joseph. We know that it was spelled a European way over in Europe, and then it was spelled the American way when he came here to the US. The last name was usually always Caesar with an A, sometimes Caesar with an O. His town of origin always began with an R and ended with an ORF. And then some of the letters in between there were different depending on what record we were looking at. So you can look in an atlas when you're looking for towns. You can look in an atlas, and those are usually arranged, have an alphabetical index in them. So I would turn to the R's and I would start looking for towns that begin with R and end in ORF, and just kind of make a list of possible towns and then investigate them more thoroughly. Almost all of the different records said he was from Austria, but then when they were asked what his language was, it was just all over the place. So we couldn't tell from all those records exactly what was going on there, what language the family spoke, what part of Austria they were from. So we have to keep accumulating records and keep evaluating the records that we find until we get to the truth. Okay, so we have these town names that we're looking for. And so the next thing that you probably will want to do if you do have a village name is that you need to locate it on a map of current day, because you might want to take a trip there. So you want to figure out where it is located, or that is a logical thing to do anyways. So that's what Aunt Lil and I did. And this took Aunt Lil and I off track for several years. We were bogged down in trying to find where these villages might be located. And remember, we're still in the 1980s. We could not Google anything. We couldn't look up online at different maps and such. So we were going to our local libraries. Aunt Lil was calling people on the phone. I believe she ordered a map of Austria, a modern day map of Austria. That was a pretty large scale map that had a lot of detailed villages on it. And from a bookstore or something, a map maker, something like that. And she ordered that and it came and we pored over it. We couldn't find those towns to save our life. Remember, we had Radmansdorf and we had Hudo. And we were told that Hudo was very tiny. So we didn't expect to find that, but we really did expect to find Radmansdorf. And this is the modern day. So this would be the 1980s and the current day, 2022 outline of what Austria looks like. And it wasn't until I went to high school and started learning about world history in my high school classes that Aunt Lil and I had our breakthrough. And I discovered that a lot of things had happened in Europe over the past 200, 300 years. There were famines, there were wars, there were plagues, there were more wars. And every time there was a war, borders were redrawn. Sometimes the countries were renamed. All sorts of things going on. So I said to Aunt Lil, we need to figure out what was going on in Austria in 1906 when our ancestors came over to the US. And so when we did that, we realized that Austria in 1906 consisted of this much larger area, going all the way down to the Adriatic Sea, going over up to Prague in the north. Krakow in Poland was part of Austria. Over to the right on this map in Transylvania, that's now Romania, and just a huge area. And so our villages really could have been anywhere in this larger Austria-Hungary empire that was in place in 1906 when the Caesars left. So once we got that straight in our heads, we found a map or an atlas of the Austrian Empire. I think it was dated around 1900. And unfortunately, I never wrote down the title or the publisher, and now I can't find it. So I don't know exactly where I got this from. This would have been something I found in the 1980s. And we found this town that was close. It was Rodmansdorf. And it looked like they just left out the ORF, and possibly because it was such a long word. And the reason that we thought that this might have been the town was because Aunt Lil recognized the name of this town over here that says Newmarket over to the right of Rodmansdorf. And she said that she thought she had read something about that area at one point, that maybe a family member had lived there. So finding those two places close together made us think that this was where we needed to look. Then we got a map of Eastern Europe for the 1980s, and we tried to kind of superimpose that over onto this atlas from 1900 and figure out where this village might be today. And when we did that, we discovered that, oh, and here's what happened to Austria after World War I. So after World War I, the empire was all broken up. And so some new countries were formed, and some of the land went to other jurisdictions and so forth. So we figured that looking at this map of Eastern Europe in the 1980s, we thought that Rodmansdorf, the village, was now in Yugoslavia. And Aunt Lil thought that that was true also, because she had an address of some relative that still lived in Yugoslavia. Now, we didn't find a town called Rodmansdorf, but in the same spot on the map where Rodmansdorf was located, there was a town, and you cannot see it very well because it's kind of hidden by those lines there. But in yellow there, it's called Radovlica, and I may be mispronouncing it. I'm sorry. These Eastern European names are hard to deal with. So I think it's pronounced Radovlica. And interestingly enough, it has the same first three letters, R-A-D, but then it kind of veers off. But by comparing the two maps, it really seemed like this was the spot. And that was 1980. And then just to finish up on the whole Eastern European saga here, Yugoslavia was broken up starting in 1991. Yugoslavia had been made up of a number of provinces or republics, and they started breaking away from Yugoslavia, and they wanted their independence. Slovenia was one of the first ones to go in 1991, and they had an almost bloodless revolution. I believe a few people died, but it wasn't anything like what happened in Bosnia and Croatia, where they fought for years for their independence from Yugoslavia. And the village Radovlica belonged to Slovenia. And so that would be where it is currently located. And so if we wanted to make a trip there, that's where we would have to go. Now, let's stop for a minute and do a hypothetical. So hypothetically, let's just say that Aunt Lil and I had no success when we had been looking for the village name of our family. We'd never figured it out. It wasn't on, let's say it wasn't on the passenger list, and it wasn't on the naturalization papers, because some of you have that scenario in your family where you're like, no, I don't have a village name. I've looked at all those resources that you just told me about, Sarah, and I can't find a village name. Well, another way of trying to get at the village name is through your ancestors' fan club, and that is their friends and family, their associates, and their neighbors. And so I would start with family. Did they have other family that came to the US? Like a cousin, a nephew, an uncle, an aunt, a grandmother, an in-law, somebody that is probably from the same village who also came to the US. So start with the other family, extended family members. And if you don't get anywhere with them, then you can move to the associates and neighbors and doing like a deep dive into their neighborhood and who their friends were, in hopes that some of those people were also from the same home village. So with my family, I knew that my great-grandfather, Joe Caesar, had a sister, Rosa, who went to Chicago also. So we could research Rosa and find out more about where she was from. I also knew that there were some vague mention of some other relatives in Chicago who were on great-grandma Mary's side of the family, and they were supposedly Pashoutzes because that was her maiden name. So I asked Aunt Lil about that, and Aunt Lil said that she knew that there was a guy named Frank Pucevic who lived in Chicago, and he was a relative. And so just taking that information there, can we find out the home village of Frank Pucevic, which in turn should be the home village of Mary Paschautz, perhaps, or close by. So Frank Pucevic, there were not that many people of that name in Chicago, so it was kind of easy to track him. But basically, I'm just starting over from scratch and working on this new relative and trying to figure out everything I can about him to see if I can find out where he immigrated from. So Frank Pucevic, here's his obituary from the Chicago Tribune. It does not tell us where he was from. It tells us the name of his wife. She also sounds like she could be from Eastern Europe. It tells us his children. It tells us that he's the fond brother of Angeline Pluth and Catherine Visage. And it gives us some other information as well that we could follow up on. But Angeline Pluth, that's a new name to me. I don't think Aunt Lil knew about her. So I searched on Angeline Pluth, and interestingly enough, she's Frank Pucevic's sister, but you can see that her maiden name in her obituary is Paschautz, which is what my great-grandma's maiden name was supposedly. So there's a little mystery here, like why is there Pucevic? Why is there Paschautz? I will explain. But first, let's keep going with Frank. So looking for Frank Pucevic, more records about him. Can we find his passenger list? Because remember, there's that great spot on the passenger list where it asks what their previous residence was in the old country. And so if we find that, is that going to give us the information that we need? Well, yes, it does. So Frank Pucevic is actually listed as Franz. And that makes sense because Frank is an American or Anglo-Saxon name that would be used in an English-speaking country. And Franz definitely sounds Eastern European. And he came over in 1913. And his last permanent residence, you can see with the arrow over here to the right, is Hutto, which is exactly what I would have thought it would be, because that's where Mary Paschautz was supposed to be from. And he's her relative of some sort. And then we get clarification of what the relationship is. He says in the column where they ask if he's going to visit anyone in the US, he says, I'm going to my uncle, Joe Caesar, 511 19th Street, Bedford, Indiana, which of course then leads us to believe that Mary Paschautz Caesar is his aunt. And so I made up a little tree for you so you can see what I'm talking about a little bit. So over on the right, we have my side of the family. We have Mary Paschautz Caesar, my great-grandma. We have Fanny and Lillian, two of her daughters. So that's Aunt Lil and my grandma. And we have my dad and me. Then over on the left-hand side of this tree, we have Anton Pucevic. And so that is Mary Caesar's brother. He's the father of Frank, who came to Chicago, and Angeline Pluth, who came to Chicago. And he's also the father of Anton Jr., who stayed in Slovenia. And we actually tracked down some of his relatives, and that's who we visited with when we went to Slovenia. So that is how those Chicago relatives are related to us. And I have some DNA matches to the Chicago relatives as well. So let's fast forward. Oh, let's let's tie this up here. So Aunt Lil died in 1990. And so had she been in better health, I think she would have loved to go to Slovenia with us and seen the sites and visited with the family and so forth. But unfortunately, she did pass away and that didn't happen. So we planned our trip to Slovenia, our family planned our trip to Slovenia in 2007. And we took my father, my mother, my Aunt Joanne, which is my father's sister, me, my brother and sister, and my sister's husband, John. So all of us went, and it's a big adventure to travel with all your adult relatives and try to keep them all in line. I was in charge of planning the trip and telling people where to go. Like, now we have to go here. We have to check into this hotel. It's over there. We have to go get this train. And I was kind of in charge of all of that. And it had its ups and downs, but overall, I think we were all very happy that we took this trip. We were healthy. We were able to, all the people on the trip, even my elderly parents and aunt were able to walk and see the different sites without difficulty. And I think it was a great trip overall. And we had lots of adventures. Now, we did see family when we were over there. So this is my great grandma's side of the family. So this lovely family, I actually found them on the internet, and because now we had the internet in 2007, and I saw that they were living in one of the villages nearby there, and I sent them an email and said, "Are you, related to so and so and so and so?" And they said yes. And so I said very carefully, I didn't want to presume or anything, but I said, we're American relatives of yours. And I told them exactly how we were related. And I said, we're planning to come to Slovenia and just, sightsee this summer. And, if we were able to stop by and say hi, we'd love to do that. And so they very graciously invited us over to their house, and they gave us a meal, and all three generations live in the same house. So the grandma and grandpa and the mom and the dad, and then there's two sons, one of which is pictured here. And I think the son looks very much like my great uncle Frank. This is my grandma Fanny's brother, Frank. I was just really struck by it. I thought, wow, there's such a family resemblance. And I bet they're probably about third cousins with one another. They're not close relatives, but there's a resemblance. Now, the family lives on a farm, and they raise fruit, and they also sell the fruit at a roadside stand and make schnapps out of it. They also have sheep, and I think the mom and the dad both work at a factory as well. The son that I just showed you, he studies at the university and is studying engineering. He's quite smart. And he took us around. The son took us around a day and showed us some different sites. And this is the church that the family would have attended, the village church that the Mary Pashouts, Caesar's family would have attended, and sometimes called Pucevic. And I'll talk about that in a minute, why that we have the two versions of the last name. We went into the graveyard there thinking that we would find gravestones for, relatives that had passed away a long time ago. But all of the stones were very modern and new looking. And the only people with our last name in the cemetery was this stone here. And you can see that there's several generations of Antons buried on or listed on this stone. And that would be Mary Pashouts' brother, Anton, and his family. And they were related to the people that we visited that I just showed you the picture of. Now, I made a faux pas, but in the process, I learned about what was going on with the name. So Mary, my great grandma Mary, on all of her US records said that her maiden name was Pashouts. And this is how my dad pronounced it. He pronounced it Pashouts, like I'm saying right now. So then there was Frank Pucevic up in Chicago, and I looked at his name and I sounded it out, and it looked to me like it was Pucevic. And so that's how I was pronouncing it. Well, I pronounced it Pucevic in front of our relatives over there in Slovenia. And the son looked at me very quizzically, and I realized that I'd made a faux pas. And I said, "Oh dear," I said, "did I mispronounce your name? I'm so sorry. I've never heard it spoken before. Please tell me how you pronounce your name." And he said that they pronounce it something like this. He pronounced it really fast, and I asked him to say it several times, but it's basically something like Puszawicz. But it is spelled in Slovenia, Pusavece, BEC. And there were accent marks. So there would be an accent mark over the S and an accent mark over the C. And that would influence how it's pronounced. Now, if the name is spelled and it looks like Pucevic in English, you can see why Mary Pashouts, Caesar, might have decided to change her name to spell it phonetically, because she didn't want to have to tell people all the time, yes, I know it looks like it's Pucevic, but it's really Pashouts. So she just decided to Americanize it and to make it spelled the way in English, the way it sounded. And so that's why we had that Pucevic and the Pashouts. It was really the same name, and I was mispronouncing it, is basically what it was. Then there's our other names. So I asked our relative over there, Francie is his name. I said, "Francie," I said, "am I mispronouncing Caesar also?" And he said, "Yeah, probably." I said, "Well, in the US, the family, all of them, my grandma, her sisters and brothers, they all said Caesar." And he said, he said, "over here, it would be pronounced a little differently." He said, "there'd be an accent mark over the C again, and there'd be an accent mark over the Z. And it would be pronounced something like this, Cesar." And actually, I found some records. I started doing some genealogical research in the Slovenian records, and I did find the Caesar names spelled with a T. And so if he hadn't told me that, I might not have realized that that was also pronounced a little differently. So the moral of that story is pay attention to the accent marks and get somebody who actually knows the language to tell you how to pronounce things. So that was the Pashout side of the family. So that was my great-grandma's side of the family. We actually had success. We met up with some relatives. We talked to them. We saw where they lived. We saw where the family had lived, the village. And then we wanted to go see the Caesar side of the family. But I had not found anyone online who appeared to be, have that last name, who was still living in the area. And so I was like, well, man, did they all die out? I don't know what happened here. So we would just plan to go to the village and, kind of sightsee, look around, maybe ask some questions, maybe see if anybody had heard of our family, that kind of thing. So I asked Francie about it. I said, well, Francie, this is where we need to go. And I said, we have this address down here at the bottom on this page is an address that Aunt Lil had. And so I said, we need to go to Radovlica. And then this might be the street address, Vasgorica number 2. And Francie was like, no. So fortunately we had Francie helping us. And he said, this address is telling you that the village name is Gorica. So Vas means village and Gorica is the village name. And this means house number 2 in the village of Gorica. And then Radovlica is the post office, the town that has the post office. So the bigger town that they would have gone to pick up their mail, basically. And then Kranjsk here is, I think, the province, and then Yugoslavia, which is what it was in the 1980s. So fortunately, we had Francie there to guide us and help us get to the right village, because otherwise we would have gone to Radovlica and we would have been in the wrong place. So here's a map of Slovenia down to the really tiny villages. And you can see that Hudo is over here on the right. And this is only about 10 miles or 5 miles away, but it's kind of by winding mountain road. So it takes a little longer to get there. And then Gorica is over here, and you can see that Radovlica is here. So that's the bigger town. And remember that Joe Caesar always said he was from Radovlica or Rodmansdorf. He said he was from Rodmansdorf, which is Radovlica today. They changed the names of the villages after the Austrian Empire fell, is basically what they did. And they may have gone back to the original Slavic names. Rodmansdorf would have been a German name, an Austrian German name for the village. Why did Joe Caesar always say he was from Rodmansdorf when he was really from Gorica? Well, that might be because, you know, if people ask me where I'm from, I sometimes say Fort Wayne, but I actually grew up in a small town near Fort Wayne, but I don't tell people that. I just say Fort Wayne. So it could be the same sort of principle, but he was very consistent on all of his records in saying that he was from Rodmansdorf. So that's super interesting. I never would have known that they were from Gorica if I didn't have that other information. So with Francie's help, we got ourselves to the right village. And it was a tiny village. There were about 20 houses there out in the middle of nowhere, no services. So there were no stores, there were no guest houses. It was just these 20 houses out in this village. And when we got there, we had to get some directions. We didn't know where house number 2 was. We were sent to house number 2, but that was a new numbering system. And then the person there said, oh no, they redid the numbering system several years ago. You need the old house number 2. So we finally get to house number 2. That would have been the house number 2 that we were looking for. And this family lived there. And interestingly enough, they're in-laws of ours. They're not blood relatives of ours at all. But when we said that we were from the US and that our name was Caesar, they were like, oh, they acted like we were long lost friends. They were so hospitable, so kind. We just showed up at their house unannounced one day, and they were so kind to us. Again, you have 3 generations living in the house. It's Angela and her parents and her daughter, and her husband also lives there. They told us that the way that this house got into their family was through a marriage. So Andrew Caesar, who was my great-grandpa's brother, married Anna B, I'm going to call her because I have no idea what that name actually says at all. So he married Anna B in the 1930s. They did not have any children. Andrew died. Anna continued living in the house and lived many years longer. And some of her relatives, probably other people with the last name of B, which I cannot pronounce, moved into the house to kind of help take care of her. And somehow at some point, the house was deeded over to them by one of my relatives. And this is Anna and Andrew's wedding picture. And I think that they're the couple in the middle here. This is Andrew, and this would be Anna with the, I don't know if that's a flower up there or what that is, but we think that that's the couple there. This is a lovely picture. I think it has so much personality in it with all the different village people sitting there. So we found Anna's graveyard or grave in the graveyard, but we didn't find Andrew. So he's not, he doesn't have a stone in the graveyard. The family that we visited, Angela and her family, they had a picture of the old house before it was torn down. So this would have been the house that my great-grandfather, Joe Caesar, had lived in when he was a child. And we had a letter that Aunt Lil had gotten translated by someone at IU, at Indiana University. And it was about that house in Gorica, and it was documenting that there was a feud in the family over that house. So that was kind of interesting to actually go and see where that took place. And see some of the players that were involved in the feud. And like I said, this family knew exactly who we were. And because they had inherited the house from us and married into our family, they had some pictures of our family. I tried to hint to them that they should maybe give us the pictures that didn't pertain to their family, but they didn't bite on that. But they did let us, my dad took a picture of some of the pictures. So this is a picture of, oh, actually they did give us this picture. This is a picture of Helen. This would be Joe Caesar's mother. So this would be my great-great-grandmother, Helen. And if you remember way back at the very start of this presentation, Joe Caesar's obituary and his death certificate did say that his mother's name was Helen. So this is the famous Helen. And this is Helen's tombstone, which was supposed to be at the cemetery in that town that begins with M, which I'm not going to try to pronounce either. We went to that cemetery. We looked for the tombstone and we did not find it. So we went back and asked Angela about it. And Angela told us, and we had a little trouble with the translation of what she was actually saying. She was trying to explain it to me, and she did speak English, but I couldn't quite follow what she was saying. But I believe she said that the grave sites are rented there. So basically, as long as you pay the rent, your stone will stay up in the cemetery and everything's copacetic and great. Once the rent is no longer paid, then they take your stone down and they bury someone else in the spot and put up a new stone for that person. Now, I asked her kind of indelicately, I said, well, what happens to the body? And that was where she kind of waffled. She didn't really tell me what happened to the body. She said, oh, they take good care of it. There's nothing bad that happens. But I couldn't tell whether they take the casket out and rebury it somewhere else, or if they buried the other person on top of them, or what happened. So I wasn't quite sure about that, but that's why we didn't see a lot of old looking tombstones in the cemeteries, because they were taken out and new ones were put down all the time, apparently. So we were lucky that we had this photograph of Helen's gravesite because it no longer exists. We did go to that church. It was locked. We couldn't get in. We did see that on the outside of the church, there was a memorial to people lost in World War I, and it included an Anton Caesar. And this turned out to be my great-grandpa's Joseph's brother. And Aunt Lil had a picture of him, and she gave me a photocopy of it. You can see that there. I don't have the original because Aunt Mary threw it out. And this is what Anton looked like, and he died in World War I, and another brother died in World War II. So this area was quite involved in both world wars, unfortunately. Also on the outside of the church were some frescoes. We were told this was 15th century, and a lovely carved crucifix. We did visit Radovlica, which we thought was our hometown for a long time because that's what the records had kept saying. And it was a lovely town. It had a 17th century old section with cobblestone streets and these lovely houses that were also, I believe, constructed maybe from in the 1700s. I read somewhere that this was an ancient town and that they had found references to it in the 12th century. So that would mean that this town was around in the Middle Ages. And it would be the market town that the people from the villages nearby would have gone to do their shopping and their business. We ate in a traditional Slovenian restaurant, is what we were told that it was. And it was basically German food, but you couldn't say that to them because they didn't want that comparison to Germans. But it was sausages, it was sauerkraut, it was heavy potato-based diet foods. And this is my family. This is my Aunt Joanne, my sister, my brother-in-law, my brother, my mom, and my dad in Slovenia. And then finally, I don't think I mentioned this because no one in the family mentioned this to us. This area of Slovenia is the Alps. So the Alps cover parts of Switzerland, Austria, Italy, and Slovenia. And so you would think that my grandma or my great grandparents might have mentioned that they were from the Alps. But no, the first we ever heard of it was when we were planning this trip and we were looking on the map and we said, oh gosh, this is in the Alps. So it's a lovely, lovely country. I recommend going even if you're not Slovenian. We have some lovely alpine lakes. This was our bed and breakfast that we actually stayed in. And look at the view in the background, if you can even believe it. It was magical. It really was. There's me and my sister and her husband. And this was how the farmers stored their hay and dried their hay. And here's another lovely alpine lake. And that is my story about how I found my ancestral homeland.
Thank you, Sarah, for a wonderful presentation. I love that everybody gets to see you do something other than DNA periodically. So this was a good opportunity to show your amazing sleuthing skills. So thank you for that, and have a wonderful evening, everyone, and hope to see you on Tuesday. Bye, everyone.
See ya.